I was in a motel, definitely in the wrong part of town. I was literally trying to get the bike fixed and get back on the road without losing time. And there was a fight happening outside my hotel room, and I foolishly, I listened for a while thinking somebody's going to get killed, and foolishly opened the door and tried to step in.
Welcome back to Crisis What Crisis, the podcast that aims to guide you towards a more resilient life and whatever it might throw at you. If this is your first time with us, then please hit subscribe wherever you're watching or listening. It really helps make sure that these, I hope, useful conversations are shared as widely as possible. The conversation today will be focused on a particular aspect of crisis management: endurance. How can we, when faced with difficulty, whatever its cause, endure and progress? And I'm delighted to say that we have the perfect guest to help us navigate this topic. Long-distance cyclist, adventurer, broadcaster and author, Mark Beaumont. Mark is a man who knows what it is to endure. The statistics tell the story. In 2008, Mark broke the world record for a circumnavigational bike tour of the world, travelling 18,000 miles from Paris to Paris. The new record was set at 194 days and 17 hours, beating the previous record of 276 days. Mark endured many hardships during that ride. One day of drama in particular in Louisiana that we will discuss later. Suffice to say, how he continued is beyond belief. His video diaries of that ride won him a BAFTA nomination. Next up, Mark cycled the Americas, climbing the highest peaks in North and South America along the way, as you do. Then he swapped the bike for a boat, first rowing through the Canadian Arctic to reach the North Magnetic Pole, the furthest north anyone had rowed. And then in early 2012, Mark joined another crew in an attempt to break the world record for rowing across the Atlantic Ocean. But after 27 days and over 2,000 miles into the expedition, the boat capsized. What followed was an incredible, terrifying 14-hour ordeal. Again, we'll talk about that later. When someone had the audacity to break Mark's circumnavigation record, his reaction, of course, was to get on his bike. And during the summer of 2017, this time with a support team, he smashed the new record with a total time of 78 days, 14 hours and 40 minutes. Incredible. And there have been other adventures along the way, as well as a number of successful books, including The Man Who Cycled the World, Around the World in 80 Days, and Africa Solo, and Endurance. In the 2018 New Year Honours, he was awarded the British Empire Medal for services to sport, broadcasting and charity. And for those of you who enjoy Succession, Mark is also the man who actually succeeded Logan Roy when he replaced the actor Brian Cox as rector of Dundee University. Mark Beaumont, thanks for joining me. How are you?
I'm great. Great to be here.
Now, you just returned from another adventure, am I right?
Yeah, it's a bit of a shock being here in a heat wave in London, which timestamps when we're recording this, but I was in the Arctic a few days ago, 500 miles north of the Arctic Circle in Svalbard. And to say that's another world is an understatement.
My goodness. What was the challenge?
The challenge was a personal passion. I just, I wasn't filming this time. I wasn't making a documentary. I love spending time in wilderness locations like that. We were doing ski mountaineering and sailing around the very remote sort of western fjords of Svalbard. It's a part of the world where the glaciers are carving into the ocean, and outside of Tierra del Fuego and parts of Chile, I can't think of anywhere else in the world where you've got the mountains and the glaciers rearing out of the water quite like that. It's extraordinary. I mean, within a few hours of sailing out from Longyearbyen, which is the small town at the heart of Svalbard, a blue whale, crested alongside us and flicked its tail at us, the world's largest mammal. And the polar bears, the walrus, the wilderness, no Wi-Fi, no phones, completely off grid for 10 days. So it was pretty extraordinary. So, to come back, see the kids, see the family, put my suit on and come to London, it's a
shock to the system.
It's a shock, yes.
Mark, as I was sort of preparing for today's conversation, I wondered how many days of your life that you've spent either in a saddle or in a boat or with your boots on climbing a mountain during the course of these adventures. Have you got any idea how much of your life you have spent enduring?
My career happily spans the digital age. So most of what I did, starting from being a 12-year-old kid pedaling across Scotland, was long before we had Strava or ways of tracking our activities.
Yeah.
So a lot of it is sort of lost and but as it should be for adventures. To give you some simple numbers, I mean, of course, I've spent thousands and thousands and thousands of hours, hundreds of days, out there doing adventures. If you think that quite a few of these projects have taken half a year plus, I mean, in your introduction, you mentioned around the world in 80 days. That was 1,100 hours of time trialing. So on your own, on a bicycle, in your own head, thinking your way through that task for 1,100 hours. I should say with an amazing team around me, always with the love and support and dedication of an amazing team. But ultimately, as the athlete, you've still got to put yourself through, as you've rightly pointed out, a huge amount of time. And I think that's the bit that people often miss when they see the BBC documentaries and the outputs. They often say things to me like, Mark, I'd love to do what you do. And I always say to them, I think you like the idea of what I do when you see it edited into a half-hour doc.
Yeah, exactly right. Well, I want to get into that in more detail. This is a conversation about endurance. It's a topic we've touched on in a different context with other guests. And those conversations have often gone to, the nature v nurture debate, biology or biography. Which is it for you?
I think, to give you a political answer, it's both. It has to be both. It's always both. I was homeschooled. I had a very unique start to life if I compare it to my friends, because I spent the first 12 years on a small organics farm in the foothills of the Highlands with my sisters. My two pals until I was 12 were my sisters. There was no playground. We had 60 goats, 13 horses, 200 free-range hens. We had a farm to run, and so I didn't socialise. I didn't interact. I didn't build a sense of competition and playground antics until well into my high school. So that gave me a complete sort of swallows and Amazons existence.
Was it just geography that led your parents to make that decision about you, or was it there was obviously more to it than that? They were determined that you would have that start in life?
Yes, they were. I think very much led by my mum. She was very interested in everything from alternative education, alternative medicine, organics. You can see that, you can paint the picture. It was in the 80s.
Forward-thinking woman.
Yeah, very, very independently minded.
Had she been brought up in that kind of environment?
Not really. No, she grew up on a farm, but not really. No, it was very much. So to back to your point on nature nurture, I guess if there's one theme that I think we're likely to return to is with endurance is being independently minded. Forget the specifics of what you do, whether it's sport, business, public life. It's the ability to stand on your own 2 feet, action your own ideas, and have the gumption to step out when often it's not the done thing. I've been in the game of firsts and fastest my whole life. So by definition, I'm trying to do things where there's no track record, there's nobody to follow. And so to your question of nature nurture, that's got to come from somewhere. It's not just because I'm technically the best bike rider. I'm not. I'm a big 6'3", 92 kilo lump of an athlete. So, it's not because I think I'm, God's given talent to cycling. Far from it. It's got to be something else. So the quiet confidence, and I always use that phrase, the quiet confidence to step out, try things that are not being tried elsewhere, back yourself, build a plan, build a team. That is at the heart of your question of nature nurture, as opposed to am I physiologically the strongest or most gifted at what I do? Clearly, you've got to have the core competence. You've got to have the makeup, whether that's the intelligence, the physicality. You've got to have the toolkit to be able to operate well in the world that you take on,
and the discipline to make the most of that.
And discipline. Process is often overlooked, because again, people just look at outcomes, they look at the result, but actually the boring bit, the diary planning, the process, what it actually takes to pull off anything significant in life, is something you got to learn. I've got two amazing sisters who had exactly the same formative years as I did, same parents, same environment, and we've all ended up in completely different walks of life, different jobs, different politics, almost different values. So I think it's two.
Can I ask, from that same upbringing, just professionally, what do your sisters do?
So one's a midwife and one's an educational psychologist. So one works in education and one's in healthcare.
Yeah.
And we all have very different outlooks on life. Mine is a lot more entrepreneurial. And I look at what my little sister does, doing 12-hour night shifts, bringing human beings into this world, and think, my goodness, I've got a silly job compared to that. That's
on the front line of
incredible,
resilience.
Absolutely incredible. But clearly a very different approach to, entrepreneurial risk, which I think is at the heart of what I do in both sides of my life. I often joke that I spend half my life in Lycra and half my life in a suit. And whether I'm, in Lycra or a suit, I'm in that leadership role where I'm making decisions that other people look at me and go, really?
Yeah.
Can we do that?
Yeah.
Nature, nurture, where does that come from? I think you got to learn that.
Yeah.
I think you got to learn, most of that you've got to learn. You got to learn to back yourself. You got to learn to step out. We're creatures of habit at the end of the day, aren't we?
We are. So you mention it, but I think you're 11 when you move from homeschooling and that environment at home into school. That's a massive thing for an 11-year-old boy. I mean, you had not really had what we would consider to be a kind of, a connected upbringing, a socialised upbringing, and you're then put into a high school in Scotland. And it's not that long after, I don't think. I think you're 12 when you then decide to ride from John O'Groats to Land's End.
Yeah, that's right.
Those two things connected, without wishing to get too analytical about it. But I mean, was the kind of challenge of seeing if you could do that related to this, I imagine, fairly epic challenge of trying to find your place in that school?
Yeah. I mean, that's a positive spin on it. I think the reality is the cycling and the adventure was a bit of a coping mechanism. Mm-hmm. My daughters are 9 and 7, and we live in Edinburgh, and we live a very sociable life. Dinner parties, play dates. Every weekend, like a lot of us, is busy. I didn't have any of that. The big event a couple of times a year was when, Grandpa came to visit and took us to Bridge of Calais Hotel for Sunday lunch. And I'm being glib, but, there wasn't a huge amount of interaction. We went to Ailith, the local town, on a Saturday lunchtime to art class, and, I went for some cello lessons. But, normal social interactions, learning to fend for yourself, didn't happen in the same way. It was life on the farm, and we spent an hour or two a day around the kitchen table learning. But I've got a pretty relaxed view on primary school. I know a lot of listeners might disagree on this point, but it doesn't take 7 years to learn to read and write. It's, primary school is basically a construct so grown-ups can go to work and so children can be suitably entertained and educated. It doesn't focus education the way high school does, clearly. So, I literally spent an hour or two a day doing what was necessary around the kitchen table, and the rest of the time was working on the farm. We had 60 goats to milk every morning and horse boxes to muck out. So then to be dropped into a school of 1,300 kids at the age of whatever I was, 11 going on 12, was a heck of a shock. And it was a real sink or swim, because there was nothing to really prepare me for that.
Yeah.
And playgrounds are tough. I had the wrong colour shoes, I had the wrong haircut, the wrong backpack, just simple things. And the irony, of course, with school is, it's about conforming, it's about fitting in, it's about doing what the crowd does. And then you realise in life after school that it's your individual interests and personality that defines you. So it's often taught out of you in the playground to be individual, to pursue your interests. And I always saw that sort of with interest, because I hadn't sort of been institutionalized by school for my first 11 years. So I got bullied. I'll laugh about it because it wasn't that serious, but it wasn't fun either.
Tell me, how did it manifest itself? What was
it?
Because the kids knew, presumably.
Yeah. I mean, put simply, the cool kids were in the playground, and what was defined as the geeky kids were in the back playground. And for my first year and a half, I was neither in the front playground or the back playground. There was just a few who were left wandering the corridors because they didn't fit into any crowd. Now, that horrible social hierarchy that exists in high schools can be crushing. And as I say, I can laugh about it now, and I've got very fond memories and lifelong friends from high school. But it took me a while to find my feet because I was socially inept. I mean, I didn't have a clue. I knew how to interact with the horses and the farm animals, but I had no idea how to interact with kids of my own age.
Tell me how that leads to cycling being
I think I sort of
there's an obvious kind of metaphor of
I spent
now I'm literally on the road and I am not going to stop.
I mean I went to a school where the religion was rugby, so there wasn't a lot of other choice around sports. And certainly to be good at the things that I was passionate about, which was skiing, riding ponies and cycling bicycles, sort of adventure sports, didn't really count. So I was not considered a sporty kid at school, far from it. Very much the last picked at football and rugby and anything that counted at school. And I very much did these things not to be competitive, but just because throughout my childhood to that point, I'd pursued the ambition and I just loved time in the outdoors. But it wasn't like I was having to join the Scouts to do it. Life was in the outdoors because everything I did was on the farm until I was 11, and I was given a huge amount of freedom to go off to overnight adventure, to do journeys on my own.
So the confidence bit,
it was there. I was 11 years old when I said to my parents, "Can I cycle to Pitlochry," which was 18 miles away. I mean, I can't quite imagine in a year and a half, 2 years' time, my daughter just disappearing off on her own for an 18-mile cycle.
Yeah.
But I had that. And I sort of said it was a coping mechanism when I suggested to my parents that I cycle Land's End John O'Groats as a first year at high school. They rightly pointed out, "Look, Mark, you've not really cycled off the farm before, and, why don't you try something smaller first?" So, that's why it got sort of pared back to cycling coast to coast across Scotland, which was a 130-miler. And I loved it. And it wasn't just the ride that I enjoyed, because it was my thing. It was something I was good at when I was having a tough time at school. It was something positive in this sort of new, slightly scary world. It was also the planning of it, going door to door, doing some charity fundraising, afterwards handing a charity check to Princess Royal. I mean, what a buzz as a 12-year-old to do the whole cycle from planning, creating, storytelling, seeing the positive impact that could create, and getting a note of recognition for that. Now, of course, I grasped onto that. Of course, as a 12-year-old, I thought, here's something positive. What's next? And by the time I was a few years older, I was ready to do my first solo ride, 1,000 miles from John O'Groats to Land's End, and on we go. So you can look back, I'm 40 now, you can look back on my career and it looks slightly inevitable. It looks quite professional. It looks like, one thing led to the next, quite systematic. But that's how most careers look in reverse.
Of course.
The way I was not there as a high schooler going, one day I'm going to be the fastest person to pedal around the planet. There's nothing in my world that tells me that's even possible, let alone it's a job. And so it's interesting how, in life, you work furiously at that next horizon, and only once you achieve that sort of summit, that horizon, does it sort of unlock the next level, what that next horizon is. And you do that consistently over time, and you continue to push yourself out your comfort zone and push your endurance and push your psychological endurance as well. And you look back after 10 years or 20 years or 30 years and you go, wow, that all makes sense. In reverse, I think that's the reverse. That's always the risk when you listen to people on podcasts like this, or you meet people who you sort of you look at their career and go, "How did you do that?" Just realize that how I see me is very different to how you see me. Very different.
Yeah,
you live your life in a far more complicated way. We all have insecurities. We all have massive setbacks. We all look around us and go, "Am I the best qualified person to do this?" And having that quiet confidence to step out and try stuff. And not getting too worried about the big picture, because it will take care of itself as long as you're furiously, involved in things that you're passionate about and can be relevant to.
One aspect of this, I suppose, is the need for sort of affirmation.
Yeah.
Because you've got this incredible confidence that's, you've explained how that may have come to pass as a 12-year-old boy to have the confidence of never mind anything else, to get on your bike and ride from John O'Groats to Land's End. I did it as a 54-year-old man the other way, which is much easier, by the way. And I was probably blooming, it was hairy in places as a grown up. As a 12-year-old kid, I suppose there's the ignorance of not knowing, really. Yeah. But for your parents knew full well, incredible sort of danger element to it as well, which obviously then develops, and we'll get onto that in more detail. But it's this kind of combination of confidence and the internal commentary that it clearly gives you a kind of, I don't know, I don't know whether these are the right words. Is it right that you don't really need that much from other people? When you say, I don't see you the way that you see you, do you need sort of, I know one of the reasons you would want to do this is the acknowledgement of it, but I sense that is not the driver for you. You don't really need the affirmation.
No, it's not the driver.
Yeah.
It's not the driver. I think as human beings, we are social animals. I think it's ironic considering the childhood that I had and how I didn't interact socially for the first 11, 12 years in what I would now consider a normal way, that I've now got a public profile. I've been a broadcaster. I spend a lot of my life being asked to stand at the front of the room in front of thousands. So that's not lost on me. I could easily be completely introverted, living in a cave somewhere. I enjoy social interaction. I absolutely love, it's ironic if you look at the other side of my life. I'm the people and performance guy. I'm the person who's passionate about building teams and doing stuff in an interactive way. And so I'm incredibly collaborative. I'm incredibly sort of strong on values and making sure that people are suitably motivated and, delegating responsibilities. I love all of that. So I think what being homeschooled and that independence gave me was that phrase that I used before, and I'll come back to that quiet confidence. I don't particularly mind if what I'm doing is not the status quo. And there's a childhood mischief about that. I quite like stepping out and doing things that other people think is not the way things are meant to be done. I remember being given the opportunity when I was at university in Glasgow to go and do an internship in Boston. What a privilege, what an amazing time to go across. And a lot of people thought it was about what they were doing, the task, the actual job they were given as an intern. That didn't really matter to me. I was in corporate HR. I had no interest in corporate HR. For me, it was about the network, the experience, the ability to step out from my peer group and just explore. And I remember one day we were staying in the halls of residence and I spotted Shakespeare in the Park was advertised, Shakespeare on the Common was, Boston Common was advertised. And I said to the group, and it shows that sort of playground mentality, I said to the group, who wants to go and get some beers and watch Shakespeare on a Sunday? And, one of the strong characters said, how silly, how daft, how geeky. And everyone put their head down and nobody did it. And I went off and had a wonderful afternoon on my own, drinking beers, watching Shakespeare. I'm not a theatre guy, really. I don't have a deep understanding of Shakespeare, but I loved that experience and I didn't care too much that nobody else wanted to come with me. It didn't even cross my mind that nobody else came with me. And do you know the amount of people in that internship came up to me after and said, I really wanted to do that. But, given the reaction and the signals from other people in the group, I didn't have the confidence to do it. And I know that might sound like a silly example, but it stuck with me my whole career. Life's full of people who want to do stuff, who are looking around them for people to tell them it's okay.
Yeah.
And if you can, without being sort of, unkind about it, not care too much, have the idea, invite people to be a part of it, but do it anyway, I think that's far, far more important than being book smart or, any other sort of gift you might be given. Because ultimately, at the heart of human happiness is a sense that you're in the driving seat, is feeling like what you do matters, how you interact with the world matters. So if you think there's in my mind, there's three spheres to your life. There's your work, there's your family, and there's the community you're a part of. And you don't interact with those spaces just because, you know, you've got a job to do and you've got to be helpful, but because the arrows come back to you. The arrows come back to you, and it sort of reaffirms the role that you have in each of those worlds. So actually, if you're having a bit of a mental crisis, if you're having a bad time, if you're having a bad day, the worst thing to do is to think too much about yourself, get too inwardly sort of introspective about it. If you're having a bad day, if you're having a crisis, help somebody else. Do an act of kindness. Do something which is utterly selfless, because what it does in a very selfish way is puts an arrow out into the world which comes straight back at you to reaffirm your identity, your values, your place, the fact that what you do matters. I remember working with the great late David Peat, BBC filmmaker, a great friend of mine who was a mentor for me in my first sort of 6-7 years of my career. And he said to me, Mark, in your career, try to become valued because of who you are, not because of what you do.
Yeah.
So the technical competence, being a great cameraman, being a great accountant, is a given. Let's assume you're great at your job. Then what? People don't value because of that technical skill set. That's what sits on your CV and that's what gets you started. But actually the personal value, the personal worth and how you value other people is their integrity, their decision making under pressure, all that good stuff.
And how you make people feel.
And how you make people feel. So once you unlock that level, you realize that it's not just about turning up and being a robot and doing a job, but it's very much about, you know, that quiet confidence you bring to the job. Yeah. The fact that people look at you and go, I remember it acutely in all of my expeditions where I'll delegate everything. I don't have anything to do except for just be the athlete when we come to the job. But people are still looking at me for that sort of, are we okay, boss? Can we do this? You know, if I smile, everyone smiles. If I look worried, my team look worried. And it affects their behavior. And as soon as you realize that, it changes how you interact with the world. You know, you stop trying to do everything and you realize it's more about composure. It's more about having that, you know, what you can unlock in other people. So back to your question, you know, it's very much about, you know, having that ability to sort of see yourself differently so you can. The kid in me wanted to do things which weren't necessarily that cool at the time. I had no idea it could become my job. It did become my job. I remember having those hard conversations with my dad, you know, when I was at university, with him saying, you're going to take a perfectly useful economics and politics degree and a future in finance and you're going to cycle around the world. And I said, yeah, I'm going to do that. I'm going to take on my biggest dream and adventure.
How much resistance was there?
I can understand from his perspective as a farmer and, you know, having had his challenges in business, that it seemed very risky. You know, I was in a class of 300. The sensible thing to do would be to go off and get my CA, you know, become an accountant, work in finance, take a straight line into big corporate. That was what he imagined I would do. I had the grades to do it. And so to quote unquote, you know, risk it all with this idea of cycling around the planet with no idea of how you can make that a business.
So we had an interesting conversation recently with one of your fellow Scots, Rory Stewart, who had a similar conversation with his father at a similar stage of his life. Yeah. And he went on to do something in its own way quite similar to you as well. He walked across Asia.
Great book, Places in Between.
Fantastic book, and a fantastic story. You got on your bike and decided to cycle around the world. When I asked Rory what the motivation was for him, among other things, some of which very similar to what you've been saying to us, was also an admission that there was a bit of an addiction to the risk element of it. Is there for you?
I think you've got to have that mischief. You've got to, I know it's a very uncorporate thing to say, but you've got to want to do stuff. The thing that scares the hell out of me more than anything else in life is just existing. Is just sort of marking time. I can't define it any better than that. I hate the idea of just existing. And this is not for acknowledgement. It goes back to one of your previous questions. It's not like I'm out there, even though I do have a broadcast career. I'm not necessarily doing it for other people to acknowledge, or, you know, I'm a terrible social media user because I don't really do things for reactions or interactions, even though I'm passionate about sharing my stories. At the heart of any big expedition, you've got to fundamentally want to do it. It's not because people are paying you to do it or you're going to have a profile from doing it. So to Rory's point, at the heart of any sort of journey or expedition is a very personal want to figure out something about yourself, to find out something about the world, a genuine intrigue in terms of people and place. I mean, what Rory did, and I guess what I did, and at a similar stage, is to go through a part of the world which we read about all the time in the news, but to actually meet it firsthand. You know, his walk through northern Afghanistan, I cycled through Iran and around the Baluchi Desert on the border of the Helmand province. You know, you're interacting with people that in a completely different way than you would read in the paper, and you get to reframe a lot of how you see the world.
You were also doing it at a similar time.
Yeah.
2007?
Yeah, very
you set off?
Very similar, yeah. 2007, 2008.
Yeah.
So I think, I'm not sure I would agree that, I'm not an adrenaline junkie. I don't jump out of planes and I don't like doing things where I feel like I'm out of control.
Mm-hmm.
I do like doing things which make me feel alive, where I feel like there's an edge to it, where I feel like my actions matter, my composure matters. You know, 5 days ago, you would have found me on a narrow ridge line, 500 miles north of the Arctic Circle, you know, with my crampons on, trying to get to a peak to ski off. It's not massively dangerous, but if it goes wrong, you're a long way from rescue. And there's an element there that I like, that personal responsibility. I like that. I like that being responsible for your colleagues and friends around you. I like doing things that haven't been done before. And I think if there's an addictive part, it's that. It's not necessarily the danger, but it's the responsibility that comes with trying to do difficult things.
Brilliant. Let's talk about that first bike ride, or the first circumnavigation. There were some dramas, as we'll talk about in a second, but first, can I just ask you about the slog, the grind? You know, you rode through 20 countries across Europe, the Middle East, India, Asia, as you just mentioned, Australasia, North America. You carried 66 pounds of equipment on this bike of yours, sat in a saddle. The slog, how much of that do you remember now? Or is it like any woman is given birth, it kind of gets erased somehow from your memory?
Well, you made that comparison. I'm not gonna be that risky. The durations of these expeditions do blur. Of course they do. I think when you're in your own head for months on end, time and your perspective on time is very, very interesting. It's another podcast in itself, because we're distracted all the time. We never finish the jobs we start. We're juggling, you know, our very busy lives. Whereas the incredible thing about journeys is you're doing one thing. It's all about progress. It's all about momentum. So it's unbroken. There's an unbroken task there if you're cycling around the world, length of the Americas, length of the Africa, whatever it is. So your perception of time changes massively because, you know, depending on where you are in your head, you know, there's hours. I can think of some of those pre-dawn rides, what I call the graveyard shift, that just last forever. I would define them in my memory as weeks, even though they were hours. And then there's weeks that pass in moments. So the concept of time is very fluid when you've got a linear journey and you're basically in your own head, because it's how you punctuate time, it's what's happening. Whereas our everyday busy lives here are very different to that. And I've never found anything else in life that has that what they often call flow state, that simple, you know, you got to think your way through the task. And, you know, you're either doing it or you're not.
So are you, when you're in a day like that, or you're in a session like that, are you just chunking up the time?
Yes.
Are you just, is the internal commentary simply, right, the next 100 miles? Probably for you. I'm sure you work on a time frame that's unlike most other people.
Well,
the rest of us are thinking about the next 5 miles. But you're in what, 200-mile chunks in your mind, and then you just disappear into it, or how does it work?
I'm not thinking about distance, because distance is ultimately an output that you can't control. Distance has to factor in topography, road condition, wind direction, all sorts of things you don't control. People in expeditions and people in business, their entire time define their success by things they don't control. And you really, really need to get good at focusing on behaviours around things you can control, and then mitigate and understand things which you can't. So I never ride by distance, even though I know what I need to cover to hit certain targets. So time is a far better metric for focus. It's interesting thinking back to the first time I cycled around the world, because what I did then, if you'd interviewed me on the finishing line in Paris at the Arc de Triomphe, I would have said to you, I left it all out there. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. I've just broken the world record by over 2 months. I remember the headlines going, this will never be broken, and other funny reactions. You know, it now looks like kindergarten. It talk about baby steps. I mean,
really, is that how you look back
on
it?
Yeah. You cannot even compare that first cycle around the world to what we and I say we collectively are doing in ultra endurance now. Jenny Graham with the female round the world record, mine with the male. I mean, it's another ballpark. I mean, if you'd said to me on the finishing line in Paris when I was 23 years old, one day you'll go over 100 days quicker. Impossible. There's no reference point for that, because human nature, you justify where you end up. I did the best I could. You always justify where you end up. So it's very hard to have that objectivity and go, how could you fundamentally do it differently? And that's where you have to learn from others. Time needs to pass, etc. So, you know, how I thought about it the first time around the world. Yeah, I mean, I was thinking roughly that I would need to average out a century a day, 100 miles a day. But if I'm honest about it now, with sort of nearly 20 years hindsight, the first time around the world, even though it was a record attempt, was far more about what happened off the bike than on the bike. It was much more about, where's my next meal, where am I going to sleep tonight? You know, sleeping in mosques and, you know, having armed escorts and all the exciting stuff, which is a 22, 23-year-old, when your reference point is school and university, is a proper coming of age. I recently was asked to do the audiobook for The Man Who Cycled the World, you know, a good 15 years after I'd written the book. And it was like reading somebody else's story. I almost didn't recognise myself. And I think the wonderful thing is you'll never have the raw emotions and reactions than the first time you go on a big journey like that. It could be your first startup. It doesn't need to be your first physical journey. But there's, you know, as life goes on, you know more, you're harder to impress, you're harder to surprise. You've got a toolkit to deal with what life throws at you. But when you're straight out of university and you decide to pedal around the planet, my goodness, I mean, I just remember all those situations I ended up in, which, you know, I was just a kid. I was a kid. I don't mean to patronise myself, but I was. Yeah. And then I came back over 10 years later with this dream of being the first person to get around the planet under their own steam in 80 days, you know, that Victorian fiction. And you can't compare. You know, I was then averaging 240 miles a day every day for 2.5 months. I was down to 5 hours sleep. I had a team of 40. Every moment was accounted for. It was 2.5 years planning. It was a 7-figure budget. It was a huge professional endeavour. But it was just a stepping stone from the 12-year-old kid who'd pedalled across Scotland. It's just a bigger, bolder version of the same thing.
The next part on the same road. Can we pedal back a bit, if you forgive me? The drama on that first ride, and there were a few. We haven't got time to cover them all. I know you got dysentery at one stage. How you continue with dysentery, I had no idea. But the day in Louisiana, if we can just talk about that, because it is in a way one day that kind of captures, you know, everything that can happen to you on a bike ride. Just give us the highlights, and then I want to ask you how you managed it.
Well, in a sentence, it was all going fine till 11 o'clock, and then at a crossroads, I went over the bonnet of a car, smashed the bike up. You know, I was pretty hurt. And then in the city of Lafayette, trying to get things fixed later that day, I was attacked and mugged. So a lot of my kit was stolen from me. I was in a motel, definitely in the wrong part of town. I was literally trying to get the bike fixed and get back on the road without losing time. And there was a fight happening outside my hotel room, and I foolishly, I listened for a while thinking somebody's going to get killed, and foolishly opened the door and tried to step in, at which point the bystanders to the fight turned to me, you know, pushed the door open, pinned me against the wall, you know, ransacked my room, you know, duffed me up a bit. I was left incredibly scared. I wasn't too hurt, but, you know, realising that, you know, I'd made a pretty silly mistake, albeit for the right motivations. And, you know, if you were to summarise a bad day on expedition, being run over and mugged is pretty bad.
Yeah. How do you then, you know, metaphorically and literally get in the saddle after a day like that?
Well, what's interesting there is, of course, I'm 16,000 miles into an 18,000 mile race around the planet. Everyone's starting to think I've done it. Everyone's starting to celebrate it's over, and it's often then that things go wrong. So, what can you do? What can you do? I mean, you go from thinking about the finish and having a mindset of the next week or two to the next hour, the next few moments, the next whatever. I think it's always interesting when people always ask me about crisis points. They expect some sort of super inspired, motivated person. They expect some incredible positivity. And I'm always the first to point out that most of that rhetoric that exists around inspiration and positivity is absolute nonsense. It's just, I don't know where it comes from, but it's just not to be human. It's not real. I mean, you got to call a good day good and a bad day bad. When it's 4 o'clock in the morning, when I'm injured, when everything's going wrong, don't give me a Muhammad Ali quote. Don't tell me to be happy. Don't tell me to be positive. I'm scared. It's the carrot and the stick. The fear of failure is far, far greater than the inspiration of success. It's so abstract in a crisis point, talking about the success you might well have if you fight hard for it, that it's not motivating at all. It's demotivating. So the consequence of failing, a reminder of what you've built and what you'll lose if you don't do what's necessary, that deep accountability to put one step in front of another brings a real dark humor to it, a genuine accountability. But it doesn't make you positive, inspired, happy. And I think it's so important to call it what it is and to stop in high pressure situations just telling people to, high five, be happy and be more positive. That's not helpful. I always talk to my team about being performance mindset, not positively mindset, because positive mindset, we have good days, bad days, good hours, bad hours. Just be accountable. Realize that what you think, what you say and what you do matters. That's it. So back to Louisiana, I'm scared. I'm in a position I've never been in my life. I've just been, beaten up a bit and, but the fear of failure at that point, given the success that I've built in the project and you just do everything you can to get back on the road. I can think of so many points on expeditions where I think this is the hardest moment. And whilst it's hell and I could cry, this is the bit that I'll look back on most fondly. And it doesn't make me sort of sadist. I have the awareness to know that the things which are toughest at the time become the life-affirming, career-defining bits. I sort of joke with the big races, anyone can race hard at midday. Who races hard at midnight? I took on an amazing gravel race the length of Britain a few years ago. So it's Land's End John O'Groats off-road. Right. 2,000 kilometres off-road. 60 people started and 13 people finished. 13. You had to be sort of pre-qualified to be involved, so everyone was good. Everyone was a good bike rider. Why did 47 people quit? They didn't quit because their bikes broke. They quit because at some point in those 2,000 kilometres, they stopped riding the road in front of them. Right. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. They all knew how to do it. They all had the technical competence, but the psychology around understanding.
So not injuries?
Not injuries. I mean, sure, 1 or 2 must have been injuries, but 47 didn't have injuries. And we all have the dreamer side of the brain, the aspirational, this is what I want my life to be. You then need to have the really boring, practical, diary planning, part of the brain which can back it up and understands what's the day-to-day life you need to lead that will give you those outcomes, those dreams. So ideas are cheap. Actions. Like, what do you actually do every day that gives you that? And I think when it comes to these big expeditions, having that wry smile, having that ability in your lowest ebb to sort of go, I'm there again. And not in a competitive sense, but knowing you can outsuffer, knowing, and you don't go looking for it, that would be weird, but knowing when you're there that you can cope I think is fundamentally important. And
from the age of 12, from the age of 11, when you cross Scotland to that moment and beyond, which we'll get to, that's a horrible cliche when people talk about life as a journey. I can't stand it. But it really is for you. It's absolutely the right terminology for you. You're digging into those memories every time you hit another wall, right? You're digging into the muscle memory, I suspect, sort of the physical kind of manifestation of that. But you're also able to, I'm asking the question, are you then able to say, oh no, this is like, this time before? The problem with that, of course, is that you're always, invariably, your destination is something new, is something unknown.
Yeah.
So how do you dig into that sort of memory bank and say to yourself, no, I can do this because I've done it before?
Well, on the physical side, which is maybe easier, I think a lot of athletes, even though they would have incredible, functional threshold power and, power to weight ratio, as a bike rider, for those listening, a lot of athletes would struggle with the sheer attrition of what I do. So they might be able to do a 240-mile day once, but could you do it twice, 3 times for months on end? So the physicality is having that deep. Fitness is 2 things. It's clearly the physical strength, but then the conditioning. And conditioning is your neural system, your ability to physically endure. And I say that first before answering the psychology bit, because it's actually quite important, because it's related. Because a lot of what you go through on these big expeditions is physical suffering. And so if you're going to be spending 1,100 hours time trialing, pedaling for 16 hours a day, back to back to back, and you're sleep deprived, you've got to physically be able to do that and understand how to manage your own body. I couldn't do the Tour de France, and Tour de France riders couldn't do what I do. We're just different sorts of athletes. So I think that sort of training over my lifetime to be able to do what I do physically is important. And then you layer the psychology on top, because I think a lot of people would have psychological relevance, a suitable mental toolkit based on other things they've done in their lives, but then they wouldn't have the physicality to back it up. So there's no point in it. Mm-hmm. So the psychology, I think, is really interesting, because it goes back to that phrase I've repeated now, that quiet confidence. It really is. It's not an arrogance, and it's not something that you need to talk about unless you're trying to explain it. But it is knowing in those difficult points how to be relevant. The accountability around...
How to be relevant.
Yeah. It's so easy to distract yourself when things go wrong. It's so easy to do something else. Okay, I'll give you a very quick example. Let's stick to the around the world in 80 days for a minute. So the normal psychology around cycling around the planet faster than anyone's ever done it before is everyone's got a familiarity bias. A familiarity bias is the bit that you know best. So as an athlete, most people just train harder than they've ever trained before, get to the start line, and then let's figure out what's possible. That's a normal way of racing. And you almost leave it to the race to figure out what the result is. I don't do that. I've never done that. I've pre-planned it, I've premeditated it, and we then read it off script. It's very boring. But the first time around the world, I came home within 8 hours of what I said I would. And the second time around the world, I hit my target by 1.44%. Broke the target by 37, hit my target by 1.44. So that very simple idea, you'll never do better than what you set out to do. So you've got to be very clear on what you're trying to do and how you're going to do it. So being relevant for me is not leaving it up to chance. So for example, if your focus was, right, let's cycle around the world and then let's see how I feel every day. Let's see which way the wind's blowing. Let's see how things go. You'll end up doing more when the goings are good, and then when it's hard, you'll start to say things to yourself like, I'll make it up. I'll make it up. Today wasn't the best of days. I'll protect myself. I'm hurting like hell, but I'll make it up tomorrow because my luck will turn. The moment you do anything like that, you've jumped through the escape hatch. You're never going to hit your best possible average unless you have the self-discipline to execute on the plan, regardless of the things which are outside of your control.
So where does positivity have its place from your perspective?
Positivity has its place in making sure that you're doing things that you have a fundamental enjoyment for. So it doesn't mean that life needs to be a bundle of laughs and easy and great fun. In fact, I think...
So it's meaning, not positivity.
Yeah. I mean, I think humans are best when they're struggling. Not in a sort of negative, I'm about to lose it all way, but I think the human condition is at its best when it's got something to strive for, strive to And it goes back to my point about sort of being in the driving seat and feeling like, your existence matters. It matters to your family, it matters to your community, and it matters to your work. So if you're striving for something in a positive manner, that's incredibly positive. That's incredibly positive and give you meaning. But it doesn't mean that you're happy clappy. I was on that GB Giro race, the length of Britain. The oldest finisher in the race, I think he was 58 at the time. A friend of mine is called Howard Perkins. I hope he doesn't mind the name check. And the finishing line, I looked down at his bike and he'd written 3 words on his front light and it said, safe, finish, fun. And I said, what does that mean? Because not being unkind to Howard, but if you looked at 60, athletes on the start line, all younger than him, many sort of semi-professional, and you said to me, only 13 are going to finish, I'm not sure I would have picked out Howard as one of the finishers.
Yeah.
I'm just being honest. So there he was at the finish. I said, what's your story? How did it go? And he said, that's my decision-making matrix. And in all my time, I've never found a better way of describing how you think when you're on a big, hard project. And he said, safety comes first. Whenever I'm doing something big, bold, and difficult like this, my own well-being and, for those that care about me comes top of the pile. Secondly, finish. Finishing is fundamentally important. If I set out to do something, getting to the end is important. The only reason I would not finish is if it was unsafe to do so. And at the bottom of the pile is fun. Why is it at the bottom? He said, well, somewhere along the line, remember that through the suffering, through the difficulty, I'm doing this because I want to do it. It's purposeful. So try and have fun, even if it's dark humour. Try and sort of enjoy the sunrises and enjoy the privilege. And it is a privilege of being out there doing these things. But here's the important bit. Not having fun is not a reason not to finish. So for the 47 that didn't finish, I think there's a conversation to be had around where the fun interreacts with sort of their overall passion to get to the end.
Let's take all this, and we're going to skip over some of your adventures, including the Americas, for time. And let's go to the mid-Atlantic.
Sure.
That we touched on in the intro. You're a crew member on an attempt to break the Guinness World Record for rowing the mid-Atlantic from Morocco to Barbados. After 28 days, and I think you're only 500 miles from the finish. You think you've pretty much made it, right? You're in Caribbean waters, and you capsize. Now, all that you've explained so brilliantly for us, all that psychology and the preparation and the kind of the planning, here you are in a capsized boat in the mid-Atlantic. Try and, first of all, please just explain what happened. And then again, I want to have that conversation about how you managed that process.
So we'd been going for 28 days. We were trying to do the first sub 1 month crossing of the Atlantic. That dream had slipped away. We were going to break the record but not go sub 1 month. We were, within 4 or 5 days of the finish in Barbados. And we'd been going 2 hours on, 2 hours off, 2 hours on, 2 hours off for nearly a month. So imagine the sleep deprivation around that, and you're rowing hard for 12 hours.
How many of you?
Triple sculls, there's 6 of us. I'm not the expert. I'm not the ocean rowing. I couldn't skipper a project like that. I was there, as usual, as the filmmaker and as an equal member of the crew, but I certainly wasn't the expedition leader. So I think that's important to say, because the natural hierarchy was around those who had a lot more ocean rowing experience. And we'd been in big seas. Now I'm talking about valleys of water, where it's 10, 12 seconds between peak and trough, and when you're out, the average speed for the mid-Atlantic crossing then was 3.8 knots, and we would accelerate down the front of waves to 16, 17 knots. So I mean, it's just extraordinary, the force of the water compared to your futile strength through the oars. But when we capsized, it was none of that. We capsized in what I would call sort of angry water, much smaller seas, but confused chop. And we capsized right on a change of shift. So normally the boat would sort of go turtle, go upside down, but then sort of re-emerge quite quickly because of the buoyancy in it. But with the change of shift and somebody coming out the cabin and the stern hatch door being open, the cabin flooded and the boat stayed upside down. So that's what happened, and you're in very confused waters, not massive waves like valleys of water, but it's hard to see where your friends are as they emerge from the upturned cabin. One of my crewmates nearly drowned in the process, and our first priority was keeping him on the surface, and it then took 45 minutes to get the life raft out and get everyone into
almost drowned because you're sort of strapped in. You're
strapped in underneath, and one was trapped in a cabin. So getting everyone onto the surface, accounting for everyone, nobody.
Just dwell on that just for a second. How did he escape from that situation? I mean, how?
Well, I mean, one of the guys trapped in the cabin waited for the boat to self-right, and then after a couple of minutes, and we couldn't see him, we didn't know where he was, we didn't know he was still inside the cabin, because I was on the rowing deck rowing. My feet were strapped in when I literally left my shoes strapped into the. If anyone's been on a rowing boat, strapped in and swam out. And to swim out, you've got to swim down underneath the safety rails and the grab rails and then swim back for the surface. The guy who was in the cabin space waited for the boat to self-right. It didn't after a couple of minutes, so had to flood his own cabin to swim out. Very claustrophobic, very, very dangerous, very difficult. But the guy who took on water, so was, being sick, our first priority, because he was, pretty weakened by having taken on so much water, having swallowed so much water, and then being sick, was his strength to survive what we needed to do next. So getting him onto the top of the boat, literally hugging onto the dagger board, whilst we got back into the water, tried to pull the life raft out, and all those things which seemed very simple in the training drills were a lot harder in reality.
You've done all this in the
we knew the theory
weeks and months in advance.
But there was mistakes. There was things which worked in theory and worked in training, but didn't work in reality. I mean, we found that the boat was sealed into its hatch on the rowing deck with an airlock. So whereas it should have just popped out, and it easily popped out because it's in an easy access hatch on the rowing deck, when you opened that hatch and it's now below the water level, and the way it would have been packed, it was sealed in. It's rubber and it's sealed in around the plastic edges. So we couldn't pull it down and out because it was literally stuck in there with an airlock. So what should have taken sort of a minute to get the life raft out, self-inflate, and we're all safe, took 45 minutes, which time you're paddling around in boxer shorts, no life jackets, trying to make sure that everyone stays on the surface. We had an axe, which the theory was, if things went the wrong way up and we had to cut in from the top into the cabin space, we could do so rather than the danger of having to swim down and back into the flooded cabins. It just bounced. I used all my strength kneeling on top of the cabin, trying to cut in from the top for half an hour. There was no way to cut into the cabin. So there was a number of theories of survival which just didn't work in reality.
How are you communicating with each other? Just tell me about, because you're not in charge, right?
Well, I'm not in charge. But
the skipper continues in that situation to be in charge.
In a crisis situation like a capsize, initially you're just trying to count heads. Is everyone alive? And when everyone's action stations, nobody's waiting for the skipper's order on anything. Everyone's just sort of doing what's necessary to stay on the surface
in the immediate moments.
Once we got everyone into the life raft, we tied a 50-meter line rope between the upturned vessel and the life raft, because we didn't want the riggers to puncture the life raft. You can imagine the rowing riggers. We then had a very sensible conversation. What do we need, and in what order? What are we going to do? We're alive, but we're not going to be found. Unless they send a plane out from Florida to do grid searches of the ocean, which is real needle in a haystack stuff, we're not going to be found. So we need to get back into the water. We need to swim back to the upturned vessel. We need to dive down. We need to go back into the flooded spaces and retrieve the satellite phone, the flares, the VHF, the grab bag with the medical supplies, all the obvious stuff, the desalinator. So Matt, the skipper, talked through what needed done. We all kind of knew because we'd been on the training. But here's the knock. There's a big difference between knowing what to do and doing it. And what scared me the most looking back on the Atlantic is only 2 of the 6 of us ever got back into the water. Only 2 of us did what was necessary to be rescued and ultimately, save the lives of the 6. So it was very, very difficult. I mean, getting back in the first time, I felt full of strength. The adrenaline's flowing. It takes ages in rough waters like that to swim back across. When you dive down, you're opening your eyes in salt water. You're trying to navigate that dark space, reopen the hatch doors, swim in, hold your breath. There's a small gap in the footwell that's trapped air, but every time the waves come through, that closes out. So when you're underneath, you're trying to sort of get more air in. And you're just absolutely working on a priority basis, trying to find things. The first thing I would...
Each one of those dives is kind of just to give people a sense of the time.
Each time I was down, I was probably down for 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah.
But trying to grab sort of snatches of air. The first time I was down there, I salvaged what I thought was the satellite phone, and I came to the surface, and I was holding a flare, and so it's quite hard in that dark space down there to figure out what you're looking for. It all makes sense in training. It all makes sense when things are the right way up. But in the confusion, 500 miles offshore in that sort of dark space is very, very hard. And as the swims went on, and I did this for 6 hours, I got weaker and weaker. My last swim back to the boat, there was a wooden slat that sat in the footwell that was floating alongside. And I was struggling to get back to the life raft. I was so weak, and the sea was pretty rough. And I swam towards the floating bit of wood, thinking it would give me a bit of buoyancy. And I don't think I reached it, and I can't quite remember the next minute or two, but the last time I did the swim, the team had to literally grab me and pull me in. I was absolutely finished. I was utterly finished.
So you've done this how many times?
In truth, I can't remember. Over 6 hours, perhaps I'd done 5 or 6 trips, but each time I'd been at the boat, there'd been numerous dives. And the truth was, and again, I think this is a really interesting thing about leadership and how people interact in teams. When people start to do things, it gives the space for other people not to. So if I hadn't done what I did, would have other people stepped up? So maybe it's unfair for me to sort of say, well, the guy who sat in the corner, closed his eyes and prayed for 14 hours, would have been more relevant if I hadn't done what I'd done. It's all about that sort of interaction. Now, maybe praying helped, but I think finding the satellite phone probably helped more. But what really scarred me afterwards was that big void that existed between knowing what to do, having the physicality and the education to do it.
Everyone there knew what to do.
Everyone knew what to do. And the personal accountability and behavioural change under pressure, where quite a few of the team just... Once that sort of safety cell was there, that safety cell of the life raft, they just never left it. And we did what we did. We were very practical about it at the time.
How did you feel in the moment about that?
Fine. Absolutely fine. In the moment, you go into a very analytical mindset. I go into a very analytical mindset. I know you're fighting for your life. Yeah.
And other people's lives.
Yeah.
And one might say that probably doesn't leave an awful lot of room for resentment in the moment.
I think the upset comes afterwards. Yeah. So I remember coming back, landing, and so we got picked up by 1 o'clock in the morning by a Taiwanese cargo vessel, which had rerouted, to find us. You're clambering up a 9-meter rope ladder onto this 180-meter ship in the middle of the night.
Because you'd managed to get sufficient gear out. You managed to send up a flare.
Yeah.
You managed to make clear your position.
Yeah. Contacted the lifeguards on the satellite phone. So we got rescued at 1 o'clock in the morning, which is another story. Incredibly dangerous, getting off a life raft, which is 4 times the size of this table in front of us, in the middle of the night onto a cargo ship the size of a football field.
Down the side of a cargo.
Yeah, incredibly dangerous. I mean, it nearly ran us over a couple of times, because how do you spot a life raft in the dark in the middle of the night? I mean, we're all human and we all have to deal with the pressures we put ourselves under, but it's quite nice to know in the moment you can deal with it. And I think that's the bit, that to be able to park the emotions when things go wrong and to find that absolute clarity. And again, only through extreme pressure do you have the opportunity to find such clarity, because we're normally distracted by other things. But when your life is literally on the line, and I've been in a number of situations, mountaineering in particular, where I've been with people who have sadly paid that price and lost their lives. And
can you tell me a little bit more about that? I mean, what were the circumstances?
To give you one example, then I was climbing Denali, the highest mountain in North America, in Alaska, and we were climbing the head wall above Advanced Base Camp, so you're just above 14,000 feet, going up to...
This is when you're on your ride through the Americas. You stopped off to climb a mountain.
And there's this amazing sort of there's amazing sort of ridge line that you've got to climb. And as we climbed up, it's about an 800-meter head wall. 2 climbers off to our right slipped. They were roped together and sadly, fell a very, very long way. And as we watched them falling down the mountain, we knew immediately that there was no way that they would survive that. And
these are not people that you'd met before.
Well, we were climbing. They weren't in our team, but we were on the mountain together, and we'd spent time in camp, so we knew who they were. And we climbed back down, called the rescue. It's about the highest point you can get the helicopter in, so managed to help with that process. But how it affected my team was really interesting, because for some people it completely reframed what we were doing. They didn't want to carry on because they'd witnessed people paying that ultimate price. I guess my view on it was, not to be unkind, but nothing had changed. I mean, I know climbing, some of the world's highest mountains is an endeavor that carries risk, and watching somebody, paying that price doesn't change the risk profile for me, even though I then need to go and do exactly the same thing. So it's not like I'm sitting there going, well, I'm lucky, or it won't happen to me, or any of that nonsense. But I've fully acknowledged and owned the risk before I've done it. And I think that bit about how fear or how emotions override people's behavior, you see it with businesses all the time as well, around job security or financial risk, or it could be something about your family life. How, when you turn the heat up, do you continue to be relevant when the consequences are perceived to be higher, and the emotional impact on your decision is greater? And I think the thing which I enjoy in business and I enjoy in sport is having that sort of having a high pressure situation where you get to acknowledge the emotions, but not be controlled by them.
Yes.
I find it really important in life to have people who I can chat to who are not connected to me at all. They're not family, they're not business partners. They're not connected to the outcomes of my choices. They're the sort of wise counsel. They're people I trust and admire, but are not ultimately connected with what I'm doing. So when I talk about big setbacks or big upsets or whatnot, I think to default to just sort of chatting it through with your wife or husband, or chatting it through with your business partner, is not always going to give you what you want, because there's no objectivity there. And to also default to sort of professional support immediately doesn't give time to stand on your own 2 feet, be kind to yourself, and have space. And I think
that's really
wilderness experiences, time in the outdoors, time where you can be undistracted and sort of not thinking in a conscious way, but thinking in a far more unconscious, natural way is hugely important. Because I have seen a lot of trauma, I've seen a lot of upset. I've also seen the world in a way that I think a lot of people read about. And so because I've literally traveled to 130 countries and experienced things, it's informed what I do in my life now in a way that wouldn't have if it was just sort of observing things from afar. And again, I can't assume that the people I work with or live with have the same perspective, because they've not lived in my shoes. I can't do what they do, they can't do what I do. And I try and remember that before I sort of lump people close to me and assume that they're going to have the same perspective or the same framework to help me with these decision makings.
So this point that you make about needing, or not needing, relying and indeed seeking out a group of, you said, wise counsel that have no skin in your game.
Yeah.
Either from a family or economic perspective, or from a professional advisory perspective. That's really interesting. And you've purposely set out to create that kind of counsel for yourself.
Yeah.
Because that's, you think, the most effective way to be able to get out what you need to get out, to analyse what you need to analyse, and to plan what you need to plan.
Yeah. I always joke that they're my unofficial non-execs. Yeah. Yeah, I've got a group of people, they know who they are, who, you know, I really value their input and counsel, and, you know, hopefully I can do that for others as well.
And if they become friends, great.
Yeah.
But that's not actually the motivation. Friendship isn't the motivation.
No, it's not.
It's the honesty of the exchange.
And I think there's got to be a personal interest. I think, you know, I've been very lucky in my life that people, because I have had the quiet confidence to step out, people have taken an interest in what I do. And, you know, I've been able to ask people who I really respect across industries, you know, at those big crossroads situations in my life, not really for their opinion, but that old sort of think out loud. I need to think out loud. And they're happy to do that, and they're interested enough to give me their time.
Mark, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thanks so much for joining us. I think there's so much, as I said earlier, that's translatable to other people's challenges in life. And just thank you for your time. Thank you for your sort of perspective on all this and for sharing your story with us. I'm going to end, as we always end, by asking you for your 3 crisis comforts. Before I do, we've only very recently called them comforts on the advice of a lady called Julia Samuel, who's a very eminent psychotherapist. She got quite cross with me that I used the word cure, because there is no cure when you're facing difficulty. It's about comfort. Would you agree with that?
I think it's an astute point. I think a cure makes it sound like there's an end goal and you stop. Whereas, as we all know, you never stop. So, you know, maybe this idea of just continuing to address things is more helpful. Maybe that's what she was getting at.
I think it is. Now, just give me your 3 comforts.
This is not going to be massively original, but music's always been very important to me. I'm a cellist, and one of the first proper bits of music in terms of Baroque music that I sort of...
You could have made it easier for yourself. It could have been a guitar or a flute.
I know. It wasn't my choice. Homeschooled kid here. Homeschooled kid. Big cello. Was the Bach suites. So I mastered the Bach suites when I was quite young, and they've always been an absolute go-to. I'm sure a lot of listeners will know what the Bach suites are. Look them up if you don't. But I think that familiarity, that comfort, that sort of being able to take myself back. I mean, I can still play most of them and do when I'm stressed. But just listening to Yo-Yo Ma or somebody, an absolute master playing the Bach suites would be a good crisis coping mechanism for me. I guess a second would be more of a mantra, would be more of a reminder. Not a big one for quotes, but that very simple idea that, and I'm sure we've all heard it and remembered it, but you know, I'll misquote it, but that idea of, you know, if you don't like where you are, move. You're not a tree. And I've always sort of used that idea of, if you're in a crisis, if things are going wrong, move, and move is often about time in the wilderness, changing your perspective. But the big reminder for me, whenever I'm in a corner, whenever I'm upset, when I'm having a difficult time, is move. Don't sit with it. Don't dwell with it. Don't stew with it. Move. You've got the choice to move. Have the confidence to move.
Very good.
So what have we done? We've done a bit of music. These are meant to be one-word answers, aren't we? Third.
When you're on a long ride,
yeah,
and you're off the bike, and you've refueled, you got that small amount of time before you presumably head hits pillow, and you just got to get the rest in. What do? Do you go to Netflix, or do you read a book, or are you a podcast fan? What is it?
I'm a podcast fan. Absolutely. I'm gonna go. It's not the one you suggested there. Food, nutrition. It's amazing the connection between, you know, what you feed yourself and your psychology. So whenever I also often say to people, if you're having a psychological crisis, it's normally connected to a nutritional crisis. So if you're having trouble, eat something. And that's got me out of a lot of difficult places. So it's amazing the power of food to reframe your thinking, your stress.
I'm going to give you one kind of item.
Really?
So that we can be specific.
Can I go?
Is it a gel, or is it?
No, I'm gonna go more unhealthy than that. I'm gonna go to my mum's cheesecake.
Superb. Perfect. Mark,
We got there eventually.
Mark Beaumont, thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure. Great fun. Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please do give us a rating and a review. It really helps. And if you hit subscribe, wherever you download your podcast from, you'll find loads more useful crisis conversations. You can follow us on Instagram and TikTok, and you can watch the full episodes on YouTube. Just search for Crisis What Crisis Podcast. You can also find full transcripts of this and every episode on our website, crisiswhatcrisis.com. Thanks again for joining us.